Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories. As she took the final step toward the Boeing 777 at Gate F, Amani, Washington, a poised and professional woman in a sleek business suit raised her heels, preparing to board the plane that would take her to London. The day had been long, but the journey ahead was of great significance, an important business trip that could shape her future. Just as she was about to step onto the aircraft, two figures in airport police uniforms emerged from the crowd, moving swiftly toward her. One was tall, his face flushed red with authority, and a thick mustache adorned his upper lip. The other was shorter, lean, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through the crowd. "Stop right there, you," the tall officer, Officer Miller, shouted, his voice cutting through the air, commanding attention over the hum of the busy terminal. Amani froze, startled, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes locked on the officers. A wave of confusion washed over her. "Is something wrong, officer?" Her voice remained calm, though there was a hint of exhaustion hidden beneath the surface. Without a word, Officer Davis, the thinner one, moved with practiced precision, his hands already on the handcuffs at his waist. "Hands up now," he demanded, his voice sharp, his gaze unyielding. Amani's confusion shifted to utter bewilderment. "Why?" she asked, her voice quivering ever so slightly. Officer Miller advanced, his face darkening with malice. "You are under arrest on suspicion of terrorism. Do not resist," he declared loudly enough for anyone in the vicinity to hear, ensuring that all eyes were now on Amani. "Terrorism?" she stammered, the words barely escaping her lips as a wave of shock washed over her. "You've got it wrong. I'm just on a business trip." "Shut up," Miller barked, cutting her off, and in the blink of an eye, the cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. The dry, metallic click echoed through the silence of the terminal. The crowd, previously oblivious to what was unfolding, now stared in stunned silence, their gazes filled with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and judgment. Amani was being treated like a criminal, her dignity stripped away in front of hundreds of onlookers, all while the harsh treatment continued. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, leaving her stunned and vulnerable as she was forced to walk against the flow of boarding passengers. Escorted by the two officers, in her high heels, she stumbled slightly, trying to maintain her balance, but each step felt heavier than the last. The whispers of the crowd pricked at her ears, their judgment sharp and unforgiving. What had she done? Why was she being treated like this? The questions swirled around her, but the only certainty she had was that everything she had worked for, her reputation, her career, now seemed insignificant in the face of this humiliating and unjust arrest. Amani's mind raced as the officers pushed her through the crowded terminal, each step dragging her further into the pit of public humiliation. She could feel every eye on her, every whisper cutting through the air like a knife. Some faces held curiosity, others fear, and some, too many, were judgmental. The whispers flowed like a quiet current, a tide of questions that washed over her. What did she do? Why is she being arrested? Amani's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let it show. Her face, pale with the weight of disbelief, burned with the sting of humiliation. The crowd's prying eyes were like 1,000 daggers aimed straight at her soul. She could hear the words that hung in the air. "She looks dangerous, must be a terrorist." Her high heels clicked sharply on the floor, each sound a reminder of how far from normal her life had just become. She staggered, trying to keep her balance as Officer Miller's harsh grip tightened on her arm, pushing her forward like a puppet on strings. She stumbled, barely keeping herself upright as her legs quivered beneath the strain. The weight of the officer's hands on her arms felt like chains, dragging her through the corridor as they marched her away from the gate. Away from her business trip. Away from everything that defined her. The buzz in the air grew louder, more intense, like the frantic hum of bees disturbed in their nest. Some of the voices were laced with curiosity, others with fear, but all of them felt like accusations aimed at her heart. She tried to hold her head high, her spine straight, but the tears of shame and anger welled up inside her, threatening to break free. "I have every right to know why this is happening," she thought, but the words got caught in her throat, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the moment. She felt like she was suffocating, each breath more difficult than the last. The familiar world around her, the airport, the flight she was about to board, felt miles away. All that remained was the cold, unforgiving reality of her situation. The sting of unjust treatment burned her insides. But she couldn't show them weakness. Not now. Not in front of the crowd. The officers continued to push her along, their faces unwavering. The world seemed to blur as she moved, her surroundings growing indistinct. The only clarity was the piercing judgment in the eyes of the people around her. The whispers that followed her every step. The last shred of dignity she had fought so hard to build was being torn away. Piece by piece, as she was paraded through the terminal like a criminal. She wanted to scream, to shout at the injustice. But the only sound that escaped her was the hollow clack of her heels on the cold floor, marking the rhythm of her public downfall. Amani's frustration reached its peak. And with it, a surge of defiance rose within her. The officers pushed her forward. But this time, she resisted the urge to shrink beneath their harsh treatment. She couldn't stay silent anymore. I have rights, she thought. I have a right to know why this is happening. Her heart thundered in her chest. But her voice came out clear, steady, and unyielding. I have a right to know why I am being detained, she demanded, her words cutting through the air like a blade, piercing the suffocating silence around her. Officer Miller's grip tightened on her arm, his patience thinning. Be quiet, he growled, his voice dripping with authority. You'll know when we decide to tell you. His words were meant to intimidate, to silence her, but they only fueled her resolve. No more, she thought. I won't be silenced. But Officer Davis, silent up until now, sneered from beside her. His eyes glinted with a mix of disdain and superiority. Rights? He spat, his voice dripping with venom. People like you don't get to demand rights. The words hit her like a slap. People like you. The implication was unmistakable, loaded with years of racial bias and hatred. Amani felt the sting, a sharp, bitter realization that this wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate. A pattern, a system built to undermine people like her, to treat them like less than human. Her breath caught in her throat, but she held her head higher, her eyes steely with defiance. They continued their relentless march through the terminal. But now, each step felt heavier, each whisper from the crowd a cold reminder of how alone she felt. The officers, with their cold, condescending stares, led her through the hallways. She felt the burn of 100 eyes watching her, their judgment cutting through her like glass shards. The crowd's whispers felt like daggers. What did she do? Why is she being arrested? Each question prying into her soul. Amani felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of shame and fury. How could they? But even as the humiliation threatened to overwhelm her, she kept her back straight and her head high. She couldn't let them see her falter. Not in front of these strangers. Not in front of these people who would judge her every move. Every second felt like a century as they walked, each step further away from the woman she had worked so hard to become. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a swarm of bees that refused to let her go. She must be a terrorist. The thought pierced through her mind like a knife. But I'm not, she told herself, her resolve hardening with each step. I'm just trying to do my job. I'm just trying to live my life. But it was clear now, this wasn't about who she was. It was about who they saw her as. And in that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about her. This was about the system that had been built to break people like her. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. The door to the small, cold room slammed shut behind her with a resounding echo that seemed to vibrate through Amani's entire body. The sound marked the final separation from the bustling airport outside, where she had been just moments ago, ready for an important business trip. Walking confidently to the plane. Now, she was alone in a sterile, suffocating space, the harsh fluorescent lights casting an unforgiving glow over the gray walls. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. There was no warmth here, no comfort, just coldness and isolation. Amani stood still for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Her wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, the metal biting into her skin. The sharp pain was a constant reminder of what had just happened. A constant reminder that her entire world had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. She glanced around the room, bare, impersonal, only a simple metal table and a few hard plastic chairs. Nothing to distract her from the feeling of helplessness creeping in. But she refused to let it take hold. She could not break. Not here. Not now. Officer Miller, his face still red with a mix of authority and arrogance. Casually slumped into one of the chairs opposite her. His feet were placed firmly on the table. A clear display of his complacency. As if he had already won. Like this was all just another part of his day. Officer Davis, the silent one, leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His eyes never leaving her. His presence was cold, distant, calculating. The tension in the room was palpable. But Amani stood her ground. She could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, threatening to spill over, but she kept it in check. The rage inside her burned brighter, sharper. She would not let them break her. "Okay, Miss Washington," Miller began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Get your identification out. Passport, driver's license, everything." Amani took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in her chest. Her mind was sharp, clearer than ever. She reached into her bag with her cuffed hands, pulling out her wallet, her movements slow but deliberate. Every action, every word that followed was under her control. She placed her American passport and Georgia driver's license on the table in front of him. Her fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Miller flicked through them dismissively, barely glancing at the details. "Amani Washington, 32 years old," he muttered, as if her identity was just another piece of paperwork to him. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. That name sounds familiar. The words lingered in the air, a subtle hint of recognition that didn't seem to register in either of their minds. To them, she was just another black woman they could push around, a mistake they could correct with money. But she wasn't just another woman. Not anymore. She had become a symbol in this moment, a symbol of something much larger than herself. She was the target of their prejudice, their disregard for the law, their abuse of power. But she wouldn't let them win. Not like this. Not when she knew the truth. The room felt colder as Miller leaned back in his chair. His posture casual, almost mocking, as if he owned the space. His feet were kicked up on the table, and his eyes bored into Amani with the intensity of a predator eyeing its prey. He took his time, his fingers drumming on the table as if savoring the control he thought he had over her. Officer Davis, still standing, remained silent, his gaze unwavering, but there was a tension in his stance, a subtle wariness creeping into his posture, as if he too was waiting for something, unsure of how this would unfold. The handcuffs bit into Amani's wrists, the cold metal reminding her that she was still trapped in their web of false accusations. Yet her resolve only hardened with each passing moment. They thought they had her, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. "Okay, Miss Washington," Miller said, his voice oozing with condescension, as if she were a child about to be scolded. "Get your identification out. Passport, driver's license, everything." Amani's heart thundered in her chest, but her mind remained calm. Every inch of her body screamed for action. But she knew the time for rage would come later. Now was the time for precision, for control. With deliberate movements, she retrieved her wallet, her hands still cuffed but steady, and placed the passport and driver's license on the table. Miller barely looked at them, flipping through the documents with no real interest. The disinterest on his face only fueled Amani's inner fire. He wasn't even bothering to read her name, he was just going through the motions, convinced that the color of her skin had already decided her fate. "Amani Washington, 32 years old," he muttered absently, as if she were just another name to add to a list. He glanced up from her papers, his eyes narrowing, but there was something familiar about her name, something that he couldn't place. "Yeah, that name sounds familiar," he added, half to himself, his suspicion growing. The unease in his voice didn't escape Amani's notice. She felt it, the crack in his confidence, the first hint that maybe they had made a mistake. And it was a mistake that was about to cost them more than they could possibly imagine. But she didn't show it. She stayed silent, her gaze steady, her thoughts calculating. She knew exactly what she had to do next. Amani took a deep breath, suppressing the anger that threatened to rise up. "I'm a U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Georgia," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm here to speak at a legal conference in London. I'm not the person you think I am." Miller didn't react immediately. The words hung in the air between them, a direct challenge to everything he believed he knew about her. He stared at her, his expression hardening, but he didn't say anything. Davis, standing at the door, shifted his weight uneasily. The silence stretched, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence for Amani. It was a silence she embraced. The silence before the storm. She could feel the walls closing in on them now. The weight of her words starting to sink in. The game was changing, and they didn't even realize it. Amani's eyes remained cold and steady as Officer Miller sat back, arrogantly putting his feet on the table. Officer Davis stood by the door, silent, his eyes scanning her every move. Despite the handcuffs biting into her wrists, Amani held her composure. Miller glanced at her documents, flipping through them disinterestedly. Amani Washington, 32. He muttered, as if her identity meant nothing. His eyes flickered with vague recognition, but he quickly dismissed it. That name sounds familiar, he said absently. Amani leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. I'm on my way to a legal conference in London. Miller hesitated, his confidence faltering, but he didn't respond immediately. Davis shifted, sensing the shift in power. Amani's words hung in the air, heavy with the truth they hadn't anticipated. The silence that followed was thick with realization. This wasn't a simple case of mistaken identity. She was no ordinary woman, and they were beginning to understand that. Amani's silence burned through the room, thick with tension as Miller leaned in, his voice dripping with accusation. Where were you last week? He demanded, his suspicion heavy. Davis chimed in. Have you been in contact with anyone suspicious abroad? Their questions felt like arrows, each one aimed at breaking her resolve. But Amani's voice was steady as she calmly explained the purpose of her trip. The conference, and her role there, each word deliberate and clear. Miller's eyes narrowed. A legal conference? Sounds like the perfect cover. Amani fought to keep her anger in check, but it surged inside her. They weren't listening, they were just looking for an excuse to pin something on her. She asked again for the charges. For a lawyer, but Miller only sneered. Not yet, he said dismissively. Davis added, once you're flagged, it's a mess. FBI, Homeland Security, you'll never get out of it. Your life, your career, it's ruined. Amani's heart pounded, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. Amani's patience wore thin as Miller's sinister smile crept across his face. We don't want to make this difficult for you, he said, his tone falsely comforting. You don't look like a terrorist. Maybe the system made a mistake. We can fix it for you, quick and easy. He leaned in closer. $5. You hand it over, and we'll clear you. No fuss, no reports. Davis stood stiffly beside him, his voice low and cold. $5 cash, and you're free to go. Just pretend nothing happened. Amani's eyes narrowed, her pulse quickening, but her expression remained calm. She refused to be intimidated, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. This wasn't just a bribe, it was an attempt to control her. And she wouldn't let them. Amani's silence stretched on, each second sharpening the tension in the room. Finally, she lifted her gaze, steady and unshaken. Before I make a decision, she said coolly, her voice cutting through the oppressive air. Would you mind repeating your full names and badge numbers? I want to be absolutely sure I've got it right. Miller and Davis exchanged a brief, confused look, but their arrogance still clung to them. With a sigh, Miller muttered his name and badge number. Almost reluctantly, Officer Brian Miller, badge number 1287, he said, as if it were a chore. Amani's eyes never wavered. Thank you, Officer Miller, she replied, her tone sharp and controlled. And Officer Davis? Davis swallowed, his voice shaking slightly as he followed suit. John Davis, badge number 954. Amani nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Thank you, officers, she said, each word deliberate. My name is Amani Johnson Washington. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle in. I am an assistant United States attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. The words hung in the air, a declaration that sent a cold shiver through the room. Amani stood tall, the room's oppressive silence thick around her as she placed her U.S. Department of Justice card on the table with a deliberate snap. The seal gleamed under the harsh light, her title unmistakable. My office, she began, her voice cold and commanding, investigates and prosecutes federal crimes, including corruption, abuse of power, and violations of civil rights. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the two officers. You are violating federal law right now. Officers, your actions will not go unpunished. Miller's face turned from red to pale, his arrogant posture crumbling as the realization hit him. Davis took a step back, his fear palpable, his entire body trembling. The two men, who had thought they held all the power, were now trapped in their own lies. Their arrogance shattered in an instant. Amani watched them with unwavering calm, every muscle in her body poised, as if she had already won. The door flew open with a violent bang, and a group of officials stormed in, their expressions grim. Leading the charge was a senior officer, his face set in hard lines, followed by several junior officers and an FBI agent. Their eyes quickly scanned the room, first landing on Amani, standing tall, unwavering, then shifting to Miller and Davis, who were now visibly crumbling under the weight of their fear. Their smugness was gone, replaced by sweat-soaked panic. Captain Thompson, his voice cutting through the tension, addressed Amani with respect. "Miss Washington, we sincerely apologize for this unacceptable incident." He motioned to another officer, who immediately moved to remove her handcuffs. Turning to Miller and Davis, the captain's voice became steely. "Both of you are immediately suspended pending a full investigation. Your actions are a disgrace to this department." Amani's eyes burned with unyielding fury as Miller stammered, desperately trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Please, it was just a mistake. We didn't mean to." Amani cut him off with a cold, final glance. "A mistake? You falsely accused me, humiliated me in front of hundreds of people, and tried to extort money from me. That was no mistake. It was a crime." Her voice, unwavering, left no room for mercy. As the two officers were escorted out of the room, their heads bowed in shame. The weight of their downfall became clear. Amani stood firm, knowing that the wheels of justice were already in motion. And this was just the beginning.